So in the first course section, we learned what React is and what it's about. We had a first general overview of React and why we might want to use it. In this course section, we are now going to dive into all the basics you need to know to build any kind of React app. We're going to explore all the base features, and most importantly, we are going to learn how to build component-driven user interfaces. So how to build user interfaces by embracing a concept called components, which turns out is actually embraced by React. And of course, I will explain what exactly these components are and why React embraces them in this course section as well. Now, specifically for that, as I said, we're going to learn about all the base features that make up React, all the core syntax. We're specifically also going to learn about a feature called JSX, or a special syntax called JSX, what that is and why we use it. Then, as I also mentioned, we're also going to learn what these components are, but most importantly also how we can build our own components with React and how we can use them and how we can work with them. And we're going to learn how we can work with data in React apps. Because most web applications are not just about showing some static text, but about outputting some data or updating some data when things change on the screen. And that's therefore also what we're going to learn in this course section, but also in the next course sections in general. Now, of course, I don't want to teach these things by just using some boring theory or slides. We will have all the required theory, though hopefully it's not boring, but we will also build this first example project here, this example web application. This here is entirely built with React, and we are going to build it together throughout this and the next course sections. And I'm saying and the next course sections because it turns out that React has a bunch of core features, and we will need a lot of these features in this application. It might look fairly trivial, but it actually isn't. Once we finished this first application, which also is not the only one in the course, you will have learned about basically all important key concepts which you need over and over again in any React app you're going to build. Now, what is that though? It's an expense tracker. We can see our expenses also by year here. We can filter. And you see, as I filter, this user interface automatically updates. It updates and with a nice animation, and it shows us the expenses for a selected year. And of course, we can also add a new expense. For example, maybe I bought some books for $39 in 2020, let's say on December 16th. And if I add this expense here, you see it shows up here, the chart updates, and the data is also there if I switch to another year and then back to 2020. So this expense tracker is what we're going to get started with. And as we're going to build it step by step, we are going to learn about all the key concepts you gotta know when working with React. So let's now dive into all these important basics and fundamentals. And for that, keep in mind what you learned in the first course section. React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. And we also learned that, of course, in general, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are about building user interfaces as well. But I also mentioned in the first course section that we use libraries like React because that simplifies building those user interfaces. We don't need it. You can build any website without React. But if you're having more complex user interfaces, like the one we have in this expense tracker, if you use something like React, it all of a sudden becomes much easier to build something like this. You won't have to focus on all the nitty-gritty details, and it will be less error-prone if you use something like React, because you will be able to focus on your core business logic that makes up your application instead of having to focus on the actual steps of updating the page when something happens somewhere. That's why we use libraries like React. And to make that job simpler for us, to make that work simpler for us, React embraces a concept called components. React is all about components. But of course, that brings up one important question. What exactly is a component? Well, let me come back to this question in a second. Instead, let me come back to this first sentence here. Even though we don't fully know yet what components are, why could React be about one concept in its core? Because all user interfaces in the end are made up of components. So what could be a component then, if it is something which is crucial in all user interfaces you see? Well, let's have a look at this finished application which we're going to build throughout this and the next course sections. If you have a look at this user interface, at this web application, you might be able to identify a couple of building blocks that make up this interface. For example, have a look at the expense items down there. This in the end is the same item being repeated twice here. It's the same item, just with different data. The same would be true, by the way, here for this chart. The individual bars in that chart, that's the same item, just repeated with a different label and a different amount of filling. And that is exactly what components are. Reusable building blocks in your user interface. Components are in the end just a combination of HTML code, CSS code for styling, and possibly JavaScript code for some logic. And you don't have to reuse a component to make it a component. It's just one of its traits that it is reusable. But on this user interface, which you see here, there would be more components than just these expense items and these chart bars. The item here at the top would be a component. If we expand it, this would then be more elements inside of that component. That filter here would be a component. The overall chart would be a component. The overall list of items would be a component. But inside of the items, we could say this date item here would be a separate component. The amount here would be a component. We can really split it up in a very granular way if we want to. We got all these individual building blocks which we combine together to build a user interface. And in the end, of course, all user interfaces can be split up into components like this. Into containers and buttons and input elements and product items which are being output, something like that. All user interfaces on all kinds of web applications can be split up into components like this. And React is all about these components. You build these individual components, and then you tell React how to compose them together into a final user interface. And React embraces this concept of components because of that reusability aspect, and because it allows us to separate our concerns. Both concepts are important concepts in programming in general. Having reusable building blocks helps us avoid repetition. And in programming in general, it is good if we don't repeat ourselves. Having a separation of concerns helps us with keeping our code base small and manageable. Instead of having one large file which holds all the HTML code and all the JavaScript logic for the entire user interface, we have small separated units, these components, where every component has one clear concern, one focus, one specific task it focuses on. And if we split that code across multiple files then, as we are going to do it throughout this course, then we'll have small pieces of code which are easy to manage and maintain. And these, of course, are not concepts or ideas React invented. Instead, if we take a step back from React and we think about programming in general, then of course in any programming language, and no matter what you're building, you tend to work with functions. And you split your code into multiple small functions, which then may call each other to outsource logic into a function, to separate concerns, and to be able to execute the same code multiple times if you need to. And React just picks up that concept of functions and of separating code across functions and translates it to the front-end web application world, where we build an entire user interface by splitting our code into multiple components, which we then can mix and match as we need to. So React is all about components. And I hope I could make it clear why it's all about components and what exactly a component is. So therefore, the next question is, how exactly is a component built? Now we'll dive into the concrete code in just a second. In general, it's just important to keep in mind what I mentioned earlier. In the end, user interfaces are about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And therefore, all these components are about combining HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. When we work with React and we build components, we in the end do just that. We combine HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in all these components, and then we combine all these components together to build the entire user interface. Though I will say, whilst CSS of course matters, and we're going to add CSS in this course, it's the least important part here. Mostly React components are about combining HTML and JavaScript, and then of course you also can add CSS, but that's not the focus of React. Nonetheless, I will teach you, of course, how you can make sure that your components look beautiful. So, long story short, React is all about components and about building these components which we combine together. React allows you to create these reusable and reactive components, and you are going to see what reactive means in detail later. React allows you to build these reusable and reactive components consisting of HTML and JavaScript, and as I mentioned, also a bit of CSS. Now here's the important part though. As you will learn throughout this course, React uses something which is called a declarative approach for building these components. And you will see what exactly that is, but it basically means that with React, you will not tell React that a certain HTML element should be created and inserted in a specific place on the user interface, as you would be doing it with vanilla JavaScript, so with just JavaScript, for example. Instead, with React, and that's really important, you will always define the desired end state, the target state, or possibly also different target states depending on different conditions. And it's then React's job to figure out which elements on the actual web page might need to be added or removed or updated. And you don't write these concrete DOM updating instructions on your own, as you would be doing it with just JavaScript. Instead, with React and React components, you just define these end states and under which conditions which state should be used, and then React will do all of the rest under the hood. It's a bit like magic. It's of course not actual magic, but it will make your life as a developer much easier. So you could say that in the end, we just build our own custom HTML elements and we combine them together for building a user interface. But that's enough of the theory for now. Let's now finally dive into some code and start building these components. So in order to finally get started with this course project and to finally write some React code, we of course need a React project. And you could create a new React project as shown in the first course section, either locally, for example with create React app by using this command, which I also showed you in the first course section, or you go for a browser-based solution by typing react.new into your browser address bar, which gives you a new React project running in CodeSandbox in your browser. But for this section, as for almost all sections in this course, I actually already created a starting project for you. And you find it attached to this lecture. You find a zip file if you want to follow along locally, and a CodeSandbox link if you want to follow along with CodeSandbox, so without installing anything on your system. Now, if you do go for the local project, you must have Node.js installed, as mentioned in the first course section, and you should in general take a look at this lecture in the first course section where I explain how to create and run React projects locally on your system. And inside of that downloaded starting snapshot, so inside of that unzipped zip file, you must run npm install as a first step to install all dependencies that are required by this project to run correctly. You don't need to do anything like that on CodeSandbox, but you do need to do that locally on your system. You can ignore any warnings you might be getting there, but after you ran this command, you can run npm start to start that development server, which allows you to preview this React project. And that's the React project with which we'll continue over the next lectures. And we'll start by taking a closer look at that src folder, this source folder here. So let's now have a look at this src folder, because that is where we will spend the majority of our time. That is where we will write our React code. And the first thing you'll notice here in this starting project, which I provided in the last lecture, that we have 2 JavaScript and 1 CSS file. And the most important takeaway here, which I really want to emphasize right away, is that React code is just JavaScript code. We are just going to write some JavaScript code throughout the entire course. We're going to use React features and some special syntax introduced by React, but ultimately, it'll all be just JavaScript. Now let's start with the index.js file. You don't see it anywhere, but I can tell you that this is actually the first code file which will be executed whenever this page is loaded. So whenever you visit localhost 3000 here at the moment, this index JavaScript file holds the code which is executed initially. Though I will also say right away that it's not exactly that code, but a transformed version of that code. Remember when I said that our project setup here involves some scripts which transform and optimize the code? Yeah, that is happening behind the scenes. Basically, we will write the code in a easy to read, developer friendly way with some syntactic sugar, which makes our life as a developer easier, but we'll write code which wouldn't run like this in the browser. And especially not in all supported browsers. Therefore, the npm start process which we started here, which started this development server, which is watching our code, this process will not just watch our code and then take it and deliver it to the browser, but before it delivers it, it will transform it so that certain extra features work in the browser, even though they wouldn't work if just this code would be taken. For example, this import here, where we import a CSS file into a JavaScript file. That's not something which would work in regular JavaScript. That would be an invalid syntax. You can't import CSS into JavaScript. Well, here in this project setup, it does work. Here, in the end, it tells this npm start process, we could say, that we simply want to include this index CSS file into our overall application. that the CSS code in there should be considered and should be injected into this page, which is shown here on the screen. And that's why the styles defined in there, like the font family, but also the background color of the body, are picked up here on the screen on the page that we see. Another example for a syntax, which is not regular JavaScript syntax, would be this here. It looks like some kind of HTML code inside of a JavaScript file. And normally this also wouldn't work. Well, again, here it does work, but only because this is transformed before it's delivered to the browser. And for the moment, you just need to be aware of that those transformations happen, and that the idea of that simply is that we can write code in a nice way, in an easy way, and then still we have code in the end which runs in all browsers. Now, the fact that the index.js file is the first file to be executed is just something you have to know. I'm telling you that this is the case, because indeed it is, and it's one of the few things you need to remember. Index.js here is the first file to execute. Now, what's that file doing though? What's happening here? Well, we are importing React DOM from React DOM, which in the end means we're importing something, some React DOM object, from the React DOM third-party library, which is one of our dependencies, which is downloaded and installed locally. Now, in the package.json file, you actually see two React dependencies. React just like that, and then this React DOM thing. And whilst this indeed technically are two separate packages, you can think of that as React, the library. It's split across two packages with different responsibilities, but in the end, React DOM and React, these two dependencies, together form the React library, which we're going to learn all about in this course. So whenever we import something from React or from React DOM, it's basically both all about React, and we're using React features, as we're doing it here in index.js, where we are importing from React DOM. This simply makes a feature exposed by the library available inside of this index.js file, because that's how modern JavaScript works in general. If you define a feature, let's say a function, in file A, and you want to use it in file B, to split your code across multiple files, to keep every file small and manageable, then you have to export the feature which you want to use in file B in file A, and then import it in file B. And that's what we're doing here. React DOM, this package, is exporting some React DOM object, and we're importing it here into index.js. And we are importing React DOM into index.js to then call a method on it, the createRoot method. This creates basically the main entry point, the main hook of the overall user interface you are about to build with React. That's the idea behind createRoot, and what this does in the end is it tells React where this React application, this user interface which you build with React in the end, should be placed in the web page that is loaded. And that leads us to one other file, the index.html file in that public folder. This folder is a folder in which we will rarely work, but it holds one important file, this index.html file. This is the single HTML file which is in the end loaded by the browser here. This is basically the only HTML file that is being used by this overall React application, because it's a so-called single page application. It has a single HTML file, and all subsequent changes on the user interface on the web page will be handled by React. And it's this single HTML file that is the entry point, the place where the React-driven user interface should be rendered into, so to say. And in this index.html file, we got a regular HTML document structure. And if we have a look at the body, you will find a div like this in here. A div with the ID root in this case. That's a regular div which actually doesn't hold any content. But that's the div where we want to attach or inject our React-driven user interface. So the user interface which we will build with React. And you're going to learn how that works throughout this course, of course. So it's this div where the React-based user interface should be rendered into, and therefore in index.js, it's this div with the ID root, as you just saw. Remember, we have the ID root on that div, which we select here with some regular JavaScript code. And then we use a method from the React library, from the React DOM library to be precise, which is part of the React library though, to tell React that this should be the root of our React application, the main place where the React application gets rendered to, so to say. That's what create root does. Then we store this root object in a constant or variable, and then on that object, on that root object, we can call the render method to tell React what should be rendered in that div that we selected here. And you could, by the way, of course, also select other elements like spans or paragraphs, but a div is the most common root element that is selected. And we're in the end telling React DOM that we want to render something, we'll have a look at that in a second, in this place. So that basically the content of this div, and as you can tell, there is no content, so what's inside of this div should be replaced with that. So of course that brings up another question. What is that app thing here? Well, first of all, it's also something which we're importing. We're importing app from the app file. And that's this app.js file you just may omit, and you should omit .js as an extension in your imports here. If it's another file, like a CSS file, you have to add it. But if it's a third-party library or one of your JS files, you omit the .js. Now we can tell that it's one of our files because we have a relative import path here, starting with /, which means please look in the same folder as this index.js file is in, and then use the app.js file, so this file here. And from that file we import app. And then we do something with it, but that is definitely not regular JavaScript syntax here. Indeed, it isn't. This is a syntax called JSX, and I'll come back to it in a second. But before I come back to that, there's one key thing you gotta know about app. App, in the end, is a component. And you might remember, components are important. Here, we see our first component in action. It's this app component, which we in the end render in the place of that element with an ID of root. So in place of that div, or inside of that div to be precise. So therefore, let's now have a look at this app.js file. And this is a fairly trivial file. It holds a function named app, and we then export this function. Because, as I mentioned, in modern JavaScript, if you have something like a function or a class or an object defined in one file and you want to use it in another file, you have to export and import it. So here in app.js, where this function is defined, we export it and then we import it in index.js. And that's how these two files are connected and how we can use a feature, in this case a function defined in app.js, inside of index.js. Now what's this app.js function doing though? Not much, as you can tell. It's a function named app. Starting with a capital character might be a bit strange, but it's valid JavaScript syntax. And then all we do in here is we return something. But what we return again is strange. It's HTML code inside of a JavaScript file. And again, that's not something you regularly see. It's also not something we're used to. And it's also not valid JavaScript code, normally. Yet here, everything seems to work. And the reason for that is that this is a feature called JSX. It's a special syntax invented and introduced by the React team, and it works in these JavaScript files because of our overall project setup, and again, because of these transformation steps which are running behind the scenes. But let's take a closer look at JSX and what it is and how it works in the next lecture. So we got this JSX code here, which is basically HTML code inside of JavaScript. Indeed, JSX stands for JavaScript XML, because HTML in the end is XML, you could say. So we got this HTML code in JavaScript. And again, this is really important. This only works because there are transformation steps running behind the scenes because of this process, this npm start process which we started, which transformed this JavaScript code to more browser-friendly code before everything is being served here. And indeed, you can see that transformed code if you want to. Simply open up the developer tools, and here I'm using Chrome, which is the browser I do recommend for development. Simply open up the developer tools in Chrome by going to View, Developer, Developer Tools, or by using that shortcut. And in these developer tools here, go to the Sources tab. And this shows all the sources, all the script files, for example, which were downloaded as part of this page. Now, in here, you'll see a couple of folders, but you should see some static/JS folder or something like that, which should hold a couple of JavaScript files. Now, the exact number and names of these files might differ, but ultimately, if you click through these files, you should see some code which looks fairly cryptic, and which is definitely not the code we wrote here, or we have here in these two simple JavaScript files. Well, it turns out that this is this transformed code. And it's quite a complex code, as you can tell, because React supports many features, and this code does not just contain our source code, but the whole React library source code and the whole React DOM library source code. So the code in these files is not just our code, but the entire React package code. That's something to keep in mind. Now, in these files, in the main chunk.js file here, for example, you see a function named app. Somewhere in there, you might need to search for it with Control F, but somewhere in there, in these files, you should find your app function. But of course, this function looks quite different to the app function we have here. That's a very lean function. This function is not so lean. Well, in the end, that's this transformed code, you could say. That is that code which runs in the browser, which is not the code we wrote, but that's what this code is transformed to. And if you have a look at this transformed code, and even that look might change over time, but it will definitely not look like this. If you have a look at this transformed code, that probably is not code we would like to write. And that's why we have these transformation steps. Because we can use this special JSX syntax, which is not normally supported in the browser, whilst we're writing our code, and still it'll automatically be transformed to code which does run in the browser. So that we have the best of both worlds. Code which works in the browser, which obviously is important, and code which is easy to write for us as a developer. And I'm just putting so much emphasis on this because that can be super confusing if you're new to React. You do know some basic JavaScript, at least you should, and all of a sudden you see code like this, which is not regular JavaScript. Well, this is just developer-friendly code which we can write, which is transformed behind the scenes. Okay, so enough about JSX and all of that. Let's now really get our hands dirty. We have this HTML-ish code here in this app function. And we have that code here Because with React, we ultimately build our own custom HTML elements, as you learned. We build those components, and a component is basically just a custom HTML element. And we do that with this declarative approach, as I mentioned, which means with React, we define the desired target state, and React is then responsible for generating and running the actual DOM instructions which update what's visible on the screen. And we can see this here. This here is our desired target state. We want to, in the end, render a div with a h2 tag with this text inside of it on our screen. Because in index.js, we render this app component, this custom app HTML element, you could say. And inside of this custom element, which turns out just to be a function, more on that in a second, inside of that, we in the end just return this HTML code. So therefore, ultimately, it's this HTML code which is rendered on the screen. And that's indeed what we're seeing here. Now let's tweak this code a little bit. And here in app.js, in this function, in this returned HTML block here, let's add a paragraph where we maybe just say this is also visible. If you add this and save this file and you have this development server running, which you should, it'll automatically pick up this change. It'll notice when this file changes, and it will automatically update what you see on the page. And therefore, we now also see this text here, this paragraph. So that's how we can work with that. And we can just define that we want to have a paragraph here. Now keep in mind, in regular JavaScript, you would kind of select the element on the page, for example, with document get element by ID root, as we're doing it here. But then you would not be done. If you then want to add a paragraph, you either set the inner HTML content to something, or you first of all create a new element with document create element, creating a paragraph, and then you got your paragraph here like this, and you would set the text content to this is also visible, and then you would reach out to some place in the DOM and then simply call append or append child and add this created paragraph. That is how you would do it in regular JavaScript. And this is called imperative. This is following an imperative approach because you are giving clear instructions, clear step-by-step instructions what JavaScript and the browser should be doing. Now, this works, but it can get cumbersome. For complex user interfaces with dozens or hundreds of elements, which also might be changing and appearing and disappearing all the time, having to write all these instructions is very cumbersome. With React instead, we just define the desired end state, that we want a div and a h2 tag and a paragraph, and React will then generate these instructions behind the scenes to bring that onto the screen. That's how this works behind the scenes. Now, I did mention, of course, that for all of that, React embraces this concept of components. And as I also already mentioned, we do have our first component here, app. So this function in the end, as it seems, in app.js is a component which is used like a custom HTML element here in index.js. Let's now build up on that and let's build our first custom component. And since we ultimately want to build that expense tracker, let's also build our first component in the context of this expense tracker. Now, to work towards this expense tracker, let's again think about the kind of components we got there. And you might remember that in the end, we were able to split up this simple looking application into a bunch of components. In the chart, we had the individual chart bars, we had the individual expense items, we had the form for adding a new expense, and therefore we get a bunch of components and a bunch of components we could get started with. Now, why don't we get started with the expense item though? So this row where we have the title and the amount and the date of an expense. And therefore, we now want to build our first own component. Now, we could add it here in app.js, but it is considered a good and best practice to actually put new components into new files so that you have one file per component. And that will mean that in React projects, you will end up with dozens or hundreds of files, because in React projects, you'll have dozens or hundreds of components in the end. And that's absolutely normal. Now, to organize our source code a little bit, here in the source folder, I'll add a components folder, which will hold all these component source files. Now, I will not move app.js in there, because this app component will be a special kind of component. Not regarding its code, that will be the same code as you see it in all the other components, but regarding its role in the application. It will be our so-called root component, which means it's the main component being rendered here in our starting file in index.js. And all other components will be either nested inside of app.js or nested inside of other components, which then in turn again are nested somewhere else. Because ultimately with React, we build a component tree, you could say. You have this main app component at the top, and then below that you could have any other kinds of custom HTML elements, so other kinds of components, which in the end hold other pieces of the user interface. And big applications, therefore, of course, can result in quite big component trees, where only the topmost component is rendered directly into the HTML page with help of that React DOM render instruction. All the other components will not be rendered with this instruction, but instead will be used as regular HTML elements inside of our HTML code, inside of our components. But you'll see that all in action in a second. So inside of the components folder, I'll add a new file. And I'm using shortcuts here. You can also use these buttons, of course, for adding folders and files. And I'll add a new file here, which I will name expense_item.js, because this will hold my expense item component. Now, one word about the file name. Here again, you are generally free to name this however you want, but it's a common convention in React applications to name it like this. Starting with a capital character, one word, where if you combine multiple words in one word, every sub-word, so to say, starts with a new capital character, like the I here in item. And then inside of this component, if the file is named like this, you of course should have a component that is dealing with rendering expense item data, so that the file name tells us which kind of logic and HTML code will live inside of that file. So now let's write the concrete component code in that new file. And of course, that means that we now finally have to understand what component code is. How is a component written in React? Well, we already saw it in app.js. It's just a function. And that is a key takeaway. That is super important. Definitely keep that in mind. A component in React is just a JavaScript function. A special kind of function, special regarding what it returns, that it does return this JSX code, but other than that, it's just a JavaScript function. Therefore, if we want to create an expense item component here, we add the function keyword, give it any name of our choice, though again, the convention is to repeat the file name here, just without the extension, so expense item. And then in here, we return the HTML code, the JSX code, which should be brought onto the screen by this component. So for the moment, I'll add a h2 tag here and say expense item in there. Now that's our first very basic custom-made component. And of course, it's quite similar to the app component, which I gave to you, because in the end, all components are similar. Components are just functions which then return HTML code. And of course, the HTML code you do return in a component depends on what that component should render on the screen. Of course, that's not our final HTML code for this kind of component. Now, to use this component, we need to export it. Otherwise, it's only usable inside of that file, and that's not helpful to us. So we add an export statement, which in JavaScript simply looks like this. We export this function as the default for this file. Now we can import it in another file. And as I mentioned, we're not going to import it in index.js, and we're not going to render it like this, because we only do this once for our root component. Instead, I now want to use my custom component here like a regular HTML element, so like a H2 element, inside of the HTML code written in the app component here. Hence, at the top of the app.js file, we should now import our custom component. So we simply import expense item from /components. We need to go into this components folder because that's where the file lives, /expense item, and then without the extension. This path in the end tells JavaScript that we're looking for an expense item file in a components folder which sits next to this app.js file in which we have this import statement. Now that this is imported, the cool thing is that we can just use this like a HTML element. So we can, for example, replace this paragraph with expense item, like this, opening and closing, written like this. The key difference to the built-in HTML elements just is that it's not starting with a lowercase character, but with an uppercase character. And indeed, your own custom components must start with an uppercase character when you're using them in JSX code like this, so that React is able to detect that this is a custom component. Because the simple rule which React applies is that lowercase elements are built-in HTML elements, so it will look for them as built-in elements, whereas elements starting with an uppercase character are elements defined by you or some other developer. So this is a custom-made component, and we have to use the name which we used here in the import as a name here, because that's how this connection is established. This tells React that we want to use this component which is imported under this name from the expense item file. If we now save everything, all the files, and we go back to the browser, we see expense item showing up here, which of course is the H2 tag rendered by our own custom component, because we now created and imported and used this custom component. And it's always these steps. You create a component, which is in the end just a function returning some HTML code. You then export it, and then ultimately you import it in the file where you want to use it, so that there in the JSX code you can use it like a HTML element, just starting with this uppercase character. Okay, so we created our first custom component. It's definitely not too exciting, but it is a custom component. And we're using it in app.js. Now let's make it a bit more exciting at least. And for that, in the expense item.js file, I want to tweak the HTML code which is being returned here. Let's say an expense item should not just be some title, but we also want to display the amount of this expense and then also the date. So therefore, we want to write HTML code which nicely displays and structures these three pieces of information. Hence here, we could say that we want to have a div HTML element which displays the date later. And for the moment, I'll just put date here as a placeholder. And then next to that div, I'll have, let's say, another div which actually should display the title, let's say inside of a H2 tag, title. And then also another div next to the title with the amount. Now you can see this is getting unreadable, But even worse, it seems to have an error. My IDE is complaining about this line of code. Now, regarding the readability, we could try to split it across multiple lines, but that would be kind of invalid. But we have a bigger problem anyways. This code is not valid like this. In React components, there is one important rule regarding this HTML, this JSX code, which you return inside of a component. You must only have one root element here per return statement, or per JSX code snippet, you could say. And here we have this div side by side with this div, which means we have two root elements here in this statement. And that's simply not allowed. Now, why is that not allowed? That's something I'll come back to in a deep dive lecture later in this section. For the moment, let's just accept that this is not allowed. And therefore, the question is how we may work around that. One of the easiest workarounds is to wrap this into another div, opening and closing. So an opening div and then a closing div. I will also show you another workaround later, but that is a simple workaround we can apply immediately. Now, regarding the readability, we can improve that by also wrapping this all in brackets, simply to signal to JavaScript that this is one and the same statement, even if it should span multiple lines. And then we can restructure this as we want to. Though the quickest way of restructuring this really is to use the auto format shortcut, which I just did. You can find this if you go to your preferences, keyboard shortcuts, and there you search for format document. This shortcut, if you press this, it automatically formats your code and makes it easier to read. And I will use this shortcut a lot throughout this course because it keeps our code readable and manageable. And now we expanded this HTML code of this component, and we now have more than just one h2 tag. And very important is that rule of having only one root element. Inside of this one element, which we return here, so inside of this main div, which we return here, you may then have multiple elements, and these elements then also may be side by side, as you can tell. It's really just the root element in a JSX code snippet, like here when we return it, which must only be one element instead of multiple side-by-side elements. But with that, we now prepared our basic structure here. Now, of course, for title, we might now say car insurance. For amount, we maybe say $249.67, something like this. And for date, we might say something like March 28th, 2021. Something like this. And if we now save this, that's what we see here. Still not looking super nice, but we can see it, and we can see that we can have more complex HTML structures inside of our components as well. Nonetheless, of course, our applications also should look nice. They should not just have some HTML code which is ugly. So let's now have a look at how we can add some basic styling here. Now, regarding the styling of our components, we still use CSS. But there is nothing too React specific when it comes to that CSS code. In the end, we can just add a new CSS file, and typically, for the CSS code of a given component, you add that file next to the component JavaScript file, and that would be the expense item.css file here. Then you want to write your CSS code in there, but since this is no CSS course, I don't want to bore you with writing a lot of CSS code, and hence you attached find a finished expense item CSS file, which you can simply download and use, or simply download it, open it, and copy the code you find in there into your expense item CSS file. Now, back in expense item.js, we need to do one important thing. we need to make this overall build process aware of that CSS file and tell it that the CSS code in there should be considered and should be injected in the finished application. Because it's not by default browsing all your files and automatically including everything. You explicitly have to tell React, you could say, or that build process, that a certain file should be considered. For expense item.js, we did this with this import in app.js. For expense item CSS, we need to do that inside of expense item.js. There, we simply import /expense item.css, just like that. This simply tells the build process that this CSS file should be considered. Now, inside of that CSS file, I in the end just prepared a bunch of CSS classes which can be added to elements to apply a certain look. And therefore now on this HTML code in expense item, in our component, we need to add these classes. For example, on the wrapping div here. Now there's one special thing here. We don't type class here, as we would do in regular HTML, but instead class name. And this can be strange, but you have to keep in mind that this here is not really HTML. It looks like HTML, but it's this special JSX syntax invented by the React team. And in the end, under the hood, it's still JavaScript code. That's why most attributes are the same, but not all. And here, the class attribute was renamed to class name because class is a reserved word in JavaScript. Technically, it would still work if you would use class here, but you should use class name. Now here on this overall div, which wraps everything, we then add the expense-item class here. On this div, which holds our title and our amount, we add another class name, which is expense-item __. So here we got 2 underscores, description. And then here on that div with the amount, we simply add class name and then expense-item __, price. And if you now save everything, it should look like this, which is definitely nicer. Still not the final look we want, but definitely nicer. By the way, I'm super zoomed in here to make this easier to read, otherwise it would look something like this. And that's definitely also not great, but again, it's not the final look. Again, let me zoom in closer so that we can better see that though. Now that is how easy it is to add styling to your React components though. It's really not too fancy. You have to be aware of the fact that it's class name instead of class, but other than that, it's really just standard CSS code, which then is added to your elements. And in that CSS code, you can use all the selectors you might know. You're not limited to classes, but again, I don't want to turn that into a CSS course, so we'll keep that fairly simple. This import might be the strangest thing in the end, because that is needed to make this entire project aware of that CSS file. And that's how we can style our components. So now we know how to style our components. And again, we're definitely not done here. This is not the final look I want to have. But before we dig deeper into tweaking the final look and adding more UI elements, let's think about one maybe obvious problem. We will probably not just have one expense, and definitely not an expense where the data is just hard-coded into the component as it is here. The date is hard-coded here, the title is hard-coded, the amount is hard-coded, and it's the only expense we have. In our final tracker, we want to have an unlimited amount of expenses if we want to. We want to have multiple expense item components in action. And after all, that is one of the core ideas behind components. It's not just the separation of concerns, it's also the reusability. We want to define a component and its HTML code once, and then we want to be able to reuse it. And at the moment, we're not able to do that. Therefore, that will be the next problem we'll work on. But before we work on that, there's another problem which we have to solve first. And that's something I just mentioned, that all that data is hard-coded here in this JSX code. This is unrealistic. Some data may be hard-coded sometimes, but here for an expense item, something like the date and the title and the amount would typically be dynamic, which means it's not hard-coded in the HTML code. Instead, we receive that data from somewhere, for example, from the user who entered it into a form, and we then output it dynamically. Now, for the moment, we don't have the capabilities yet to receive it from the user, but we can fake dynamic data by at least adding more than just HTML code to this component. Because after all, we must not forget that a component in React is just a function. And that earlier I mentioned that components are the combination of HTML, to some extent CSS, and also JavaScript. Now we definitely see HTML in action. We also saw some CSS being added, but where's the JavaScript other than that being a function? Well, let's add some JavaScript code in that function before we return. For example, let's add a constant, so a variable which may never change, and in there let's store a date by using the built-in date constructor which comes with JavaScript. Let's give this constant a name. For example, expense date sounds like a fitting name. And then let's maybe set an initial date value here, which is the year 2021, March as a month, and since the month field here starts at 0, March has the number 2, and then there the 28th. This is how we can create such a date object, and this, and that's really important to me, is just regular JavaScript. Has nothing to do with React. And we can, and we typically do, have JavaScript code like this in our components. Here, just to create some dummy data, later in the course and in your React applications, that could be any kind of code. For example, to send a HTTP request and fetch data from a database, to validate user input, or to do any other kind of task. So here we have our expense date. We can also have our expense title here, which is maybe car insurance. So a simple string stored in this constant. And then our expense amount, which is, let's say, a number, 294.67. So we have these three constants, regular JavaScript code, and we now want to output these values here in this HTML code. And that is a typical task. Typically, you don't have data hard-coded in HTML. Instead, to output dynamic data, you use a special syntax React gives you inside of these JSX code snippets. You can replace hard-coded data with opening and closing curly braces. Single curly braces, opening and closing. And the special thing about these curly braces inside of your JSX code snippets is that in these curly braces, between them, you can run basic JavaScript expressions. For example, 1 + 1. You can execute something like this there, and it's now the result of this expression, which will be output on the screen. So if I run 1 + 1 between curly braces here, we see 2. We can also do something like math random here and generate a random number with the built-in math object. And we see the number here. And every time I reload, I get a new number, of course. Now that's something we can do. Now here, I don't want to get a random number. I don't want to add 1 + 1. Instead, I want to refer to the value stored in this constant. And therefore we can just repeat that constant name here. This is also a valid JavaScript expression, just pointing at a variable or constant, in this case a constant. And now JavaScript will extract the value stored in this constant and basically inject it here into this HTML code, so to say. So if I now save that, we again see car insurance here just like before, but now it's not hard-coded in the HTML code, but instead here it's output dynamically and the concrete value is taken from that constant. There, of course, it's still hard-coded, but it's just a first step. Now we can do the same for the amount. So here after the $sign, which I will leave hard-coded for now, we can point at expense amount. And for the date, we can do something similar. Here we can output expense date, though for the date, we have to keep in mind that it's a date object. And therefore, if we try to save it like this, it just breaks. Because this being a date object, it can't be output as text like this. However, we can call toIsoString, for example, a built-in method available on all date objects, to output it as a string, and now we see this at least. Not super readable, but a first step. Now we will refine and fine-tune the way this is being output later. For the moment, we just achieved one important thing. We now no longer work with hard-coded text in our HTML code, but instead we have these dynamic placeholders, you could say, where the concrete value can be the result of a calculation, of a HTTP request, or, as it is here at the moment, the value stored in a constant or variable. And now with that out of the way, we can move on and we can take a closer look at how we can make this expense item more reusable, so that it's not always the same data which we're outputting, and so that we can have multiple expense items based on one and the same component with different data. How can we make this component reusable? Well, the good news is we can already reuse it. In app.js, where I'm using it, we can simply copy that line and paste it in. And if we save everything, we got 2 expense items already. So that was easy. It's super easy to reuse a component. You can use it as often as you want. You can add it 2 more times and have 4 expense items overall. That will work. But of course, at the moment, it's not really reusable. Yes, it's technically more than once, but it's always displaying the same data. And the reason for that is that the data is baked into this component. Now, think about regular JavaScript without React for a second. There, I mentioned earlier already, we also use functions to split functionality across multiple smaller code bases, and also to have reusable functions which we can call multiple times. Now, when we write functions in JavaScript, then we make these functions reusable by accepting parameters. And that allows us to call one and the same function with different parameter values. And therefore, the function may and typically will produce different results for different input values, but it's still always the same function being called. And React basically has the same concept built in. We can make our components reusable by using parameters and a concept called props in React. Let's say in your app component, you have a goal item variable or constant defined, which holds a string of finish. And then let's say you have a custom component, the course goal item component, which has a list item inside of it, where this goal item should be output. That's just another example, not the code we've been working on, but it's another example. We can have a custom component which should output a list item, where the goal item should be output dynamically. The problem is that the goal item variable lives in the app component, not in the course goal item component. And to a certain extent that is good, because it makes the course goal item independent if it doesn't store the concrete value internally. But of course we want to define what's being output by a course goal item with help of the variable managed in app. And we don't have direct access to the HTML code output by some component in other components. We can't just send our stored data there. But instead we can utilize a concept called props. We can pass data to the custom component by adding an attribute. And inside of that component, we can then get access to all these attributes which might have been set on our custom component. Again, we're basically building our own custom HTML elements. And just as HTML elements can have attributes, it turns out that with React, our own custom components can also have attributes. There, this concept is just called props instead of attributes. And props simply stands for properties. We can set properties of our own custom components. Now, how does this props concept work though? In expense item, we have the date, the title, and the amount, and we'd like to output this here. But it shouldn't be stored in here, but instead in app.js. There, indeed, in this app component, we could have another constant or variable, expenses, which is an array, so multiple expense items. And let's say every expense here is a simple JavaScript object, which now has a title like car insurance, which also has an amount like the 294.67, and where we have a date, like this new date we created here in expense item before. Now again, we don't just have one, but we have, let's say, 3 such expenses here, or maybe 4. Now, to make sure we don't have to type this all by hand, attached you find a simple text file which contains 4 dummy expense items, which you can just grab and copy into your expenses array. These objects also have an extra ID field, which we don't need at the moment though. Nonetheless, now you will have 4 objects inside of this expenses array. And now we want to pass the data of these different objects to these different expense items. That means we want to make these expense items configurable from outside, you could say. The data should not be stored inside of them, but instead received from outside. And that works with this props concept I just mentioned. In app.js, we can simply add attributes to these custom HTML elements, so to these components. I'm using these terms interchangeably here. And for example, we could add a title attribute here to expense item and set this to a value of toilet paper. So we can just type toilet paper here. But now I would in the end again be hard coding some data in this JSX code. Since we already have this expenses array here, I also can dynamically retrieve the title stored in this first expense item for this first expense item here. And we can do this by again using this single curly brace syntax. We can not just use this between opening and closing tags of elements, we can also use it for assigning values to attributes. And here I can then access expenses, which is this array. There, the first item with index 0. And there, this first item, like all items, is an object which has a title property, for example. So we can access dot title here. And now this title is being passed to this expense item. Now we can do the same for the amount. We set, let's say, an amount attribute. And these attribute names, by the way, are totally up to you. I'm going with title and amount here, but you could pick different names. And as a value for amount, I again access expenses and the first expense there, and then the amount field. And last but not least, we can add a date attribute and access expenses, and there the first expense dot date. You just have to make sure that the part after the dot matches the property names here, because we are accessing these objects. Now I'll hit the auto format code to make this easier to read by splitting this across multiple lines. And we can now do the same for the other expense items. So I'll just repeat this, but then access the second expense here, and the third expense with index 2, and the fourth expense with index 3. Now if we save that, we see no change though, because we only did the first half of the work we need to do. We added these attributes with any names of our choice here, because these are our custom elements. Hence, these attribute names are up to us. But inside of that component code, so inside of expense item.js, we also now need to do something with these received attribute values. And that's the half which is missing. Now the question is, how do we get access to the values defined in the place where we use our custom components? And the answer is parameters. I mentioned that in regular JavaScript, we use parameters for passing data into functions, and it's kind of similar for React. However, we're now not getting a title and an amount and a date parameter, as you might think, but instead we get one parameter. React will ensure that we get one parameter in every component which we use as a component, like we're doing it here for expense item. And that one parameter will be an object which holds all the received attributes as properties, hence the name props for the overall concept. Therefore, we get one parameter, and you can name this parameter whatever you want. It's your function. You could name it data. But typically it's named props to make it clear that this is this object which holds all the values we get for the attributes on our custom element. And to be precise, we get key value pairs in this props object here, which is passed in by React automatically. The keys will be the attribute names defined here, so title, amount, and date in my case. And the values, of course, will be the values set here. So if I now want to output the title received, here in this h2 tag, I can now access props.title, like this. Getting access to this props parameter, and then there to the title property, which will exist because we set a title attribute. Now, if you chose a different name than title here, like for example, name, if you chose that as a name, for example, then you have to access props.name here. So the key which you access on your props object has to be the name you picked for your attribute. Now here I'll go back to title and therefore adjust it here in both places again, but you have to make sure that this matches. Otherwise it'll not work. Now which names you choose, if that's title or name or text or whatever, that's up to you. It's your component. But of course you typically want to choose prop names and therefore attribute names which are self-explanatory and which makes sense. So since we're passing in the amount here, amount makes sense. Something like some number would be valid, but wouldn't make a lot of sense, I guess. So I'll revert that. Now, therefore, in expense item, we can not just output props title, but also props amount. And here for the date, props.date.toISOstring. And that means we can now get rid of these three constants here, since we now get all the data we need from outside this component. We're not defining it inside of the expense item component, inside of this function, but instead it's in the end defined in app.js and passed into expense item for the different usages of expense item through attributes. And that's how you share data between React components. You can make your components truly reusable and configurable by using this props concept, which is one of the key concepts React has to offer. You'll use props all the time, so keep it in mind. It's super important. Props is a super important concept because it allows you to make your components reusable, and it allows you to pass data from another component to this component. And hence, if we now have a look, we see these different expenses are rendered with different titles, different dates, and different amounts. So props are a crucial React concept. Components would not be very useful if they weren't configurable with help of props. And therefore, when working with React and when writing React code, you will often set props on components and accept props as input. Now, there are two things I want to mention here, two alternative ways of accepting or setting props you should be aware of. And I'll start with an alternative way of setting props. Because the use case we have here, where we have a component that needs almost all the data we're working with in this app, so that needs almost all fields of that raw data, that use case is quite common. And you can then absolutely set up multiple prop key value pairs. So define multiple props of different names and pass your different values through those props. But an alternative would be to instead create an expense item where you just pass one prop that could be titled expense, for example, though the name, as you learned, is up to you. And instead of passing the individual values through multiple props, you could then pass the entire data point. So the entire object in this array, in this case here, as one single prop. So as a value for one single prop, the expense prop in this case here, to expense item. You could do that as well, instead of passing those individual props. If you would use this approach here, where you pass one single prop instead of multiple props, you of course also would have to change the code inside of the component. Because now you no longer get the title as a prop, instead you only get the expense prop, or whichever name you chose for the prop. So then here in the receiving component, you would have to write props.expense.title, props.expense.date, and props.expense.amount. And of course, now we would have to migrate all expense items to this alternative way of passing data to the expense item. Now, I want to emphasize that both approaches are fine. You can pass a single prop, which contains the entire object, or multiple props, which contain the individual values. This is entirely up to you because it's your component, but I definitely wanted to mention this alternative. With that, I'll delete this example though and switch back to the approach I showed you before, because I think it's a bit easier to understand and read, especially when you're just getting started with React, but you could also pass everything in one data object. When working with props, both approaches are fine. So with that, I'm of course also updating expense item again, and I'm moving back to the individual props. Another alternative syntax you could use when working with props is exclusive to the receiving component. There we're getting this props object where we're then accessing the different properties, in this case date, title, and amount. Instead of using this approach, we could also use a feature built into JavaScript and use object destructuring right here in the parameter list. This might look strange, but is regular JavaScript code. You can use the object destructuring syntax here, where you add opening and closing curly braces, and where you then refer to the different properties of the object you are receiving here, so of the props object in this case, to pull these values by those keys here out of that incoming object and store them in locally available variables of these
titles of these names here. With that, the date prop would be accessed with just date, since we're pulling it out here. Title would be accessed under just title, and amount would be accessed under just amount. So here we're using object destructuring. This is not some special React syntax or anything like that. Instead, it's standard JavaScript syntax for using object destructuring right in the function parameter list. Now again, I will actually switch back to the old approach, which we had before, where we instead use the dot notation for accessing the different properties, but I wanted to share this alternative since you'll also see that in many React projects and since you personally also might prefer it.
Now that we learn about props, we're basically done with our first custom component. This expense item component is now reusable, and we can use this props concept to configure it differently every time that we're using it. So that the 4 times we're using expense item here, we're also getting a different output 4 times. I also just want to emphasize again that here we are indeed setting the values for the props dynamically with this single curly brace syntax, but we could also just have a hard-coded value like this here, if that is what we needed. So props are not limited to dynamically set values. We can do that, but we don't have to. The main idea behind props is always the same though. We want to make sure that we can pass data into our components to make them configurable and reusable. Now let's continue working on that expense item component, and let's continue working on that date. Because at the moment, this is clearly not too pretty, not too human readable. And instead of showing it like this, I instead want to have this calendar-like look, which you see here in this preview. I want to have my date look like that. And therefore, of course, we need to change that HTML code, that JSX code, and I'm using these terms interchangeably as well. We need to change that, which is responsible for outputting that date. And here, to build such a calendar look, we could say that inside of that main div, which should hold the overall date element, we want to have 3 individual divs like this, where the topmost div is responsible for outputting the month, the middle div is responsible for outputting the year, and the bottom div then shows the day. That's something we could do. And of course, for that, we want to extract month, year, and day from the incoming date. So from that date prop which we're setting. For that here, for the month, we can output a value dynamically and access props.date. And now what? How can we now output the month here? Well, we can use a built-in method which is accessible on all date objects in JavaScript. We can call the toLocaleString method. Now, this is not a React-specific method. You can Google for JS toLocaleString to find an official article on this method. And this method simply helps you with outputting dates in human-readable formats. And you can simply call it and then pass in 2 arguments, where the first argument is basically the language. And here I'll use ENUS to go with English. And then the second argument is an object where you configure how specifically that date should be formatted. And here we got different options where you can find more details in that article which you can find. Here you can learn more about the various ways of configuring this and using this. And here we can set month to long, for example. That's one of the provided options or one of the supported options. And if we do that and save this, we see that August and March and June are being output here, so that we got a human readable way of outputting that month. Now, doing that all inline here in that JSX code clearly works. As I mentioned earlier when I introduced this syntax, you can have expressions like this between the curly braces, but it is considered a better practice and it leads to cleaner code if you extract logic like that and don't put it into your JSX code, but instead you create a separate helper variable or constant. Something like month here, which simply holds that value, and then here between your curly braces in the JSX code, you just point at that helper variable or constant. By doing it like this, you keep your JSX code lean and you have your more complex logic in the rest of this function so that this overall is easier to read. And now we can do something similar for the day and the year. For the day, we can access props.date to local string enus. And then here pass in a configuration where we say that we want to format just the day and output it in a 2-digit format. And we can add a year helper constant where we access props.date. And then actually just access getFullYear, which is another built-in method which just extracts the year as a 4-digit number. And now we can use these helper constants to output their values like this in our JSX code. And if we do that and save that file, now we see the month, the year, and also the day in the month. And that's the raw data which I want to have here. Now, of course, one crucial thing is missing, and that would be the styling. But before we add that, let's talk about splitting components. As you work on your React application and on your React components, you will notice in any project that your components eventually become bigger and bigger as you have more and more logic and JSX code in them. This is something which will naturally happen. That is why React has this component concept. This allows you to split your application into smaller building blocks where every building block, every component, is focused on one core task, you could say. And then you build your overall user interface by combining these building blocks. By doing that, you keep every component on its own relatively small and manageable, and you keep its code base small and manageable, and you still can build a complex user interface. Now, there is no hard rule when to build a new component versus adding more to an existing component. But in this component here, in this expense item component, we could already argue that it's getting a little bit too big, though I will say that this is definitely still all right. Nonetheless, we could argue that this date object here, this calendar item which we want to show on the user interface, could be treated as a separate component. Of course, the same case could be made for the title or the amount, or title and amount combined. As I said, there is no hard rule. But since for this calendar we'll have a couple of helper constants and we'll have extra styles, I personally like to split this expense item component here into two components. The expense item component which we already have, and then a new component for rendering this date in this calendar item look. And therefore, we're now going to create our second custom component. And for that, I'll create a new file in the components folder, and I'll name it expensedate.js. Now, as always, the file name is up to you, but I recommend that you follow this convention of naming it like this, starting with a capital character, one word, with every extra word also starting with a capital character. And again, it should also express what's happening inside of that file, what that component will be about. And this component will be about rendering the date of an expense. Hence, this sounds like a fitting name to me. Now in there, we create a new component, and that still is a function. Components in React are just regular functions with the extra twist of returning this JSX code. Now I'll name it expense state, again following this convention that we repeat the file name here, and I'll then export it to make it reusable outside of this file, like this. Now in here, I wanna calculate month, day, and year, so I'll cut this logic from expense item and move it to expense date. And therefore, of course, I need to accept props as a parameter here. And I do now expect that this component will be used such that a date prop is set. Now in expense item, I want to use this new component. But before we do that, I will actually grab this div with the month, year, and day inside of it and cut it as well and return that as JSX code inside of expense state.js. And now in expense item, at the top, we can add an import and import expense state from /expense state, like this. /expense state because we're looking in the same folder as the expense item.js file lives in. And now here, where we previously had our JSX code for the date, we instead output this expense state component. And as a side note, if you have a component that has no content between the opening and closing tags, you can also write it a little bit differently. You can write it as a self-closing element like this. This is then also okay. And we could do the same here in app.js with the expense item, since this also has no content between opening and closing tag. This is totally optional, but it is quite common to do that if there is no content between the opening and closing tag. So now we're using expense state in the expense item component. And we're doing this to move some of the JSX code and JavaScript logic out of the expense item into a separate component. This component is now again also reusable, and we can use it anywhere in this React application, not just in expense item. We could use it elsewhere as well if we wanted to. And it now also helps us with keeping expense item lean. This is now again shorter and therefore maybe a bit easier to maintain and manage. And the bigger your application gets and your components become, the more you want to look into splitting them up. Though again, just to really emphasize this, there is no hard rule on when to split. This is something which will come with experience, and you'll also see plenty of examples throughout this course. Now we must not forget though, that our new expense date component needs a prop. It needs the date prop, at least that's the name I'm referring to here, inside of expense date, to, well, extract that date and format it, and extract the month, day, and year. Hence, on expense item, or in expense item, when we use expense state, we should set the date prop. And if you used a different name here in expense state, you of course want to use a different name here instead of date as well. Now the value which I pass here will just be props.date. And I know that this is now the point where it can get confusing. Because now we're basically funneling some data through multiple levels of components. In the end, we can see this component tree come to life now. Because now we don't just have the app component and then one other custom component, but we have multiple custom components and they are nested inside of each other. Just to make this really clear again, in the app component, we're using the expense item component, and inside of the expense item component, we're using the expense state component. And not just that, we're also forwarding our data with the help of props through multiple components. We're passing data from the app component into expense item, and in expense item, we're outputting some of that data, but other parts of the data, to be precise, the date, which we here also already received through props, is then forwarded even further into the expense state component, again by using props. Because props are our way of passing data from component A to B. And it's also totally fine to have a component which just passes data on. So in the end, you could say we pass data from app to expense state, the date to be precise is passed on, and we passed it on through expense item. Because that's how props work. We pass data from a component to a direct child component, so to a component which is used in that other component's JSX code, and we can't skip such a component. So if the date should be passed to expense state in the end, here in this case, since we use expense state instead of expense item, we first of all have to pass that data to expense item and then forward it to expense state. I hope this is clear. If it's not entirely clear yet, that's also something you're going to see in great detail and in many examples throughout the course. Okay, but with that we are forwarding the date and we get this separate component now. If we now save that all, we again see our date data being output here. Now we also want to have some styling, and therefore I'll add a new file, the expense date.css file. And you again find that file attached. You can just replace yours with it or open it and copy everything you find in the attached file into your expense state.css file. And once you did that, you can go to the expense state.js file. And at the very top of that file, import /expense state.css to make the entire project setup aware of that CSS file. And then add a couple of CSS classes here. On the surrounding div, we add a class name of expense-state, for example. On that month div, we add expense-date __ month. For the year div, we add expense-date __ year. And for the day, we add expense state __ day. And here I imported the wrong file. This should of course be expense state CSS. And with all of that done, if we save this, now we got this nice look here for our dates. And this looks much nicer, and we also practiced how we can add yet another component. And adding this component was optional. We could have put everything into expense item. The entire JSX code, which we have in a separate component now, the helper constants, we could have added this all into one component. We could have also added the CSS code here in the expense item CSS code. But then this expense item component would become bigger and bigger. And whilst in this case it would have still been fine, it is generally a good practice to keep your components small and focused, and that is why we did extract this extra component here. So by now we got components everywhere. We got the expenses component, expense item, expense date, app, yeah, a lot of components. But that really is what React is all about. Now obviously throughout this course we're going to learn about more features which we can add to these components to make them more interactive, to improve their performance, to send HTTP requests, and much more. But in a nutshell, and that's really important, it's all about components. And it's about props for configuring these components, for passing data into them. And components really just are these custom HTML elements where you combine HTML code, JSX code to be precise, and styling, and if you want to, also extra JavaScript logic, as we're doing it in expense state. That is really what components are about. Now, I did mention it multiple times already. We build all these components to then build a user interface. And we are already doing that. In app.js, we're using expenses. In there, we are using expense item. In there, we're using expense state. Generally, this approach of building a user interface from smaller building blocks is called composition. Now, there's one specifically interesting aspect of composition which we haven't seen thus far though. What if we wanted to create a component which actually just serves as a shell around any kind of other content? At the moment, we have highly specific components. The expense date component is about outputting a date in exactly that format and in exactly that look. The expense item component is just about outputting an expense item. And in your React application, you will always have a lot of these very specific components. All these components are also just configured through props, through the date prop, the title prop, the amount prop, in the case of expense item, for example. And again, that is fairly standard. You'll have a lot of these components in your React applications. Sometimes, however, you want to have a component where you don't configure everything through props, but where instead you're able to pass content between the opening and closing tags of that component. And here's an example where this would make sense. If we have a look at our current output, then we see two kind of boxes or containers. We got a container around all the expense items. It has a light gray background and rounded corners and a slight drop shadow, which might be hard to see. And we have a container around the overall expenses list with a darker gray background, but also rounded corners and a slight drop shadow. Now, the idea behind all these components is to have reusable building blocks, also to avoid code duplication. And here at the moment, we at least have some style duplication, also maybe some HTML structure duplication. Expenses has a div which surrounds our expenses, which applies certain styles thanks to this class. And the same is true for expense item. Now, of course, not all divs have the same look though. Inside of our expense items, we also got divs like this one, which have a totally different look. Nonetheless, we could extract this surrounding container div, which we have both in expense item and expenses.js, and extract the styles they have in common, like rounded corners and a drop shadow, into a separate component. And we could name such a component card, because this is a specific card look. And this is not a term I came up with. Instead, in general, in web development, when you hear the term card, it typically means some kind of container look with rounded corners, drop shadows, and elements like this. So that's why I'm picking card as a name here. Now, such a card component is still a regular component here. So let's create it as such. But such a card component could now do one main thing. It could return a div or any other kind of container HTML element with a class name of, let's say, card. And then we could add a card CSS file and import that into that card component. So import card.css. And now in the card CSS file, we could have, let's say, the box shadow and the border radius from expenses CSS. Maybe we would be able to extract more styles, but I'll go with these two. I'll cut them from expenses CSS and add them to card CSS inside of a card CSS class selector, which I added there. I will also go to expense item CSS. And here in expense item, in this class selector, we also find a box shadow and a border radius. So I will remove these styles from there as well. Now, why am I doing that? Just to show this kind of component. Now we got this card container component, you could say, which should act as a shell around either our expense item content or our expenses content. And that's the key. This card component will now not be configured through some attributes. Instead, my idea would be that, let's say, an expense item, we can simply replace this built-in div with our custom card component. And then we get these predefined styles for the card automatically. Maybe we then just want to make them extensible, but we get these predefined styles automatically. And for that, of course, we want to import card from ./card inside of expense item. The thing just is, if I save that, you will see that all the expense items are lost. And the reason for that is that out of the box, just like that, you can't use your custom components as wrappers around other kind of content. Having content between opening and closing tags doesn't work just like that. But of course it does work for built-in HTML elements like the div or the h2 tag. So it would be nice if we could also make it work for our custom components to build such reusable wrapper components like this, for example. And of course, React has a solution here. We can build such wrapper components. In card.js, we again want to accept props. But now, as I mentioned, we'll not work with some attributes, but instead we will use one special prop which is built into React, which every component receives, even if you're never setting it explicitly. And that's a prop which value I want to output between the opening and closing tag of this div inside of the card component function. It's the props children prop. Children is a reserved name. We don't set a children prop on this card. I'm setting a class name prop, and actually at the moment this won't do anything. But I'm not setting a children prop. Children, as I said, is a reserved name. And the value of this special children prop will always be the content between the opening and closing tags of your custom component. So in this case, this content between the opening and closing card tag, that is what will be available on props children inside of that card. And therefore, if I now save this, we got some content back. However, it's also a bit broken. And the reason for that is that I extracted some styles, which expense item and expenses had in common, but I had more styles defined for expense items, and these styles are important. But they are missing now. I am setting a class name prop on card here, but you must not forget that card is now a custom component defined by you. All the default HTML components out of the box support class name for adding CSS classes to the rendered HTML elements. But your custom components only support what you tell them to support. So if you want to make sure that a class name can be set on your card component and then has an effect, we have to tweak the code in the card component. And here we would probably want to tweak it such that we add whatever is set as a class name on card to this class name string we're setting as a class name on that div. So here we could add a classes constant, which is card as a default class, which is always applied, whitespace plus props class name. So now anything we receive as a class name from outside is added to that string. And here we can then dynamically point at this class's constant. So with that, we're now making sure that any value set on the class name prop is added to this long string of class names, which is then finally set on this div inside of the card. And with that, all if we save that, we got the same look as before, not yet for expenses, but for the expense items. But now we have this reusable wrapper component. Now we can also use that in expenses now. Here, instead of using a div, we can also use our card component. We can import card from ./card and replace this div here with that card. still setting an extra class name here as well, and also replace the closing tag. And if we do that, now we got the rounded corners back on that expenses container as well. Now, why would we do that? What did we gain by doing that? Well, in this case, of course, not a whole lot, but we were able to extract some code duplication from inside our CSS files into this separate wrapper component. And it's not just a duplicate CSS code. We also were able to extract this HTML code, this JSX code, this div here. In this case, it's just one div. But throughout the course, you will also see more complex wrapper components, which might have a more complex JSX structure, things like modals and alerts. And in such cases, being able to extract that often allows you to save a lot of code duplication, and it often allows you to keep your other components clean. And this is another aspect of composition. We compose our expense item component by using card as a wrapper, by using some built-in HTML elements, and by then also putting in the expense state. And all these components and elements are composed together to form the overall expense item component, which then again is used in other components to in the end overall build the overall user interface. So composition is important. You use it all the time when working with React. Whenever you combine components, you are using composition. And an especially important part of composition is this props children feature, which allows you to also create wrapper components, which is a special type of component, you could say, which you also sometimes need. Now again, as with all these things, you are of course going to see many more examples throughout the course. Remember, this section was about components. It was about understanding the most important concept of React, that you build user interfaces by building and combining components. And for that, we had a look at the React core syntax and JSX. We of course had a very detailed look at building and using and working with components and props, and that already leads to the last part, data. We learned how to share data across components through that props concept. Now maybe you already noticed one important thing. With all these components which we are building, in the end, we're just splitting up our code across multiple files and building blocks. So that if we want to have more than one expense item, we can just use our custom expense item component multiple times, instead of repeating all that code multiple times. That's the idea behind components. In the end, what ends up on the screen are just default HTML elements though. If you inspect your page with the developer tools, here in the Chrome developer tools with the Elements tab, you will notice that you don't see your custom components here. There is no card or expense item component, you just see divs and h2 elements and so on. And that is how the web works and how React works. These custom components are not really HTML elements which end up on the screen. You just use them in your code, in your React code, in your JSX code. What ends up on the screen are just the HTML elements, because ultimately every custom component you build either uses these built-in HTML elements, or it uses another component which at some point, if you drill into your components deeply enough, will end up using these built-in elements. And that's an important takeaway and something important to keep in mind. Now, the application we built thus far is great because we had the chance of learning about components and props with it. And these are two of the most important concepts you gotta know when working with React. I'm not sure if I mentioned it already. But of course, this application, as we built it thus far, also has a downside. In the end, it's still static. Yes, we have reusable components which can be configured with props, But ultimately, we have this expenses array in the app.js file, and this array never changes. The data here is set in stone. It's still a static application in the end. Nothing is changing here. As a user, we have no chance of interacting with this application. And that's therefore what we're going to change in the next course section when we're going to bring this to life and when we're going to learn about another concept called state. Now, before we go there though, I just got 3 other things which I want to cover here. The first thing, the first concept is JSX. I mentioned that we'll take a closer look at that, and we're going to do that in the next lecture. You could skip that lecture, but at some point you should have a look at it so that you understand what JSX really is under the hood and how it works. So I recommend that you don't skip it, even though you could do that if you're in a hurry. Now, the other 2 things I want to have a look at is how we organize our files and how we write our functions here. And therefore, let's dive into these concepts before we finish this module and move on to the next course section. Let's have a closer look at JSX. Now, I mentioned before, earlier in this module, you can open up your developer tools, and there you'll find the JavaScript code which is responsible for what you're seeing on the page. And in there, you will also find all your component functions, like this app function here. Now, it will look totally different in the end, because there you have no JSX code, because JSX code isn't supported by the browser. This in the end is just syntactic sugar, which works here thanks to the behind-the-scenes transformations. Now, we can see that the code to which it is transformed in the end looks like this here, right? This here is the code to which it is transformed. Now, this is code which still is fairly cryptic, because this actually is the final step of the transformation. We could also write code instead of this JSX code, which is a bit more readable to us humans than this, but not as readable as the JSX code. I still want to show it to you because this shows you what this JSX code actually represents behind the scenes. So here we go. Maybe you already wondered about one other thing. In package.json, we got a bunch of dependencies, and most of them are just dealing with the behind-the-scenes transformations. But we got 2 dependencies which are related to React. React and React DOM. Now, we are using React DOM in the index.js file, but we are never using React anywhere. We're never importing React anywhere. And this actually just works in this kind of project setup and in all modern React project setups which are created by Create React App. In a lot of other React projects which you'll find out there in the wild, you will actually see React imports, even though we don't have them here. Because in the past, in older React projects, you actually needed to import React from React in all your React component files. To be precise, in all files where you used JSX. You needed to always import React from React in the past. And you'll still see a lot of React projects out there which have these imports therefore. Now that we can omit this import now is really just some magic being done by modern React project setups. We needed this import in the past because this JSX code, as I mentioned, is just syntactic sugar. And under the hood, it is actually transformed to methods called on this React object, which is why we needed to import React in the past. Now let me show you what this code would look like if we wouldn't use this JSX syntax. And therefore I'll comment this out and return this alternative. Because on this imported React object, there is a create element method which we can call. And when you use JSX, it's in the end this method which is called. CreateElement takes 3 arguments. The first argument is the element which should be created. For example, a div. And if it's a built-in HTML element, you just pass in a string with the name of that element, like div. The second argument is an object that configures this element. Specifically, an object which sets all the attributes of this element. This div has no attributes, so here we can pass in an empty object. The third argument now is the content between the opening and closing div tags. And actually, it's not just a third argument. You can now have an infinitely long list of arguments, which are the different content pieces between the opening and closing tags. So here we have 2 elements, so we would have 2 extra arguments. The third argument would be our h2 element, so the first child in that div. And therefore here, again, we would call React CreateElement and create a h2 element here. And that h2 element again has no attributes, so the second argument of this second CreateElement call would be an empty object. And the third argument of this CreateElement call would be the content in this h2 tag. So this string in this case. So we would pass this string here and escape this single quote. And if we now format it, it would look like this. Now, next to this second CreateElement call, we could have a third CreateElement call, which is the neighbor element to this h2 element, so this expenses component. Again, we create an element here, but now we're working with a custom component instead of a built-in one. In such cases, you don't use a string here, but you just point at your imported function, which it in the end is, because your components are just functions, right? So here we set expenses. We point at expensive as an element here. The second argument is an object of properties that should be set, of attributes that should be set. And here we have the items prop, the items attribute. So we would add an items key here. Keep in mind, this is just a JavaScript object. So we have the property name and then a colon and then the value, which here would be expenses. And then as a third argument, we have the content between the opening and closing tags. And in this case, there is no such content, so we omit it. And this here would be the alternative to this JSX code using this React object. And therefore, if I save that, and we go back to the screen, we see exactly the same as before. Now, you could write your entire React app like this. It just turns out that this is a bit harder to read and a bit more cumbersome than using this JSX code. But that's why you needed to import React from React in all your component files in the past, because this is the under-the-hood code which kind of gets created automatically when you use JSX. Now, in more modern project setups, you can omit this React import because the project setup is able to make that transformation without the import being added. But if you see component functions where this import is there, it is there because in the past you always did need to add it. And therefore, because of that reason, I will now also import it and add it to all components where I use some JSX code. Like here, index.js, expenses.js, expense item.js, expense date.js, and card.js. Again, you technically don't need to do that, but I'm doing it to really emphasize that React is still being used under the hood here when you use JSX code, because that code under the hood is transformed to something like this before it's then transformed even more to what we saw in the browser earlier. That's important. And if you have a look at this code, it should also be clear why you need some wrapping element as a root JSX element, why you can't have just these two side-by-side elements being returned. Because how would you write this in the React CreateElement world? You, in the end, would be trying to return this. And that doesn't work. You can't return more than one thing. You could return an array, sure, but this is not an array of elements. This is two separate elements side by side. That's why you always need such a wrapper, because in the create element world, you always create one element which then may have more child elements. So that's why we have this one wrapper root JSX element which we always need. This is why we need that. That's the under the hood, behind the scenes stuff that is going on. Now I will comment this out and go back to the JSX solution, because of course we're going to write JSX code in the course. After all, this is way more convenient. But it is important to understand what is happening under the hood and how React works. So now in the last lecture, we learned about JSX and how it looks like under the hood, and why we therefore could add all these React imports to all these files which hold JSX code. Speaking of the files, let's talk about organizing them. Here, we only got a couple of components, and therefore we can store them like this. But as your project grows, and as you have more and more components, you might want to organize them into subfolders, and not just throw them all into one components folder. And indeed, that is something we can already get started with. Here, we could argue that we have some general UI components, some general user interface elements which are not tied to a specific feature of the app. And then we got some feature-specific components, like these components which are dealing with rendering expenses and expense data. And therefore, in the components subfolder, we could create an expenses subfolder, and next to that, a UI subfolder for general user interface elements. And we could move the card files into the UI folder, and the expenses, expense item, and expense date files into the expenses folder. Now you just want to make sure that you update all your imports. Like in expenses.js, where we import card, we now first of all need to go up one level with 2 dots and then a slash, and then dive into the UI folder and import card, the card file. We need to go up one level because expenses is now in the expenses folder. We need to get out of that folder into the next folder above it to then dive into the UI folder, which is a sibling folder to expenses, to the expenses folder, I mean. We don't need to update the other imports because these files are still in the same folder as expenses.js. For expense item, we also need to update the card import though. Go up one level, dive into the UI folder, and then import card. And in app.js, we no longer import expenses from components expenses. Instead, we dive into components, then into the expenses folder, and there it's the expenses file which we want to import from. So now we can adjust these imports, and if you did that, this again all works if you load it. And we're really just doing this to organize our files and to keep our components organized and to make sure that they're not all in one big folder. Ultimately, it's up to you how you want to organize them, and of course you should just organize them such that you and any team members you might be working with are comfortable working with these files. That's the most important thing which matters. Now, to really conclude this module, I just want to show you an alternative syntax for writing these functions, any kinds of functions in JavaScript. A syntax which is not exclusive to React, by the way, but which can be used in any modern JavaScript application. Instead of writing a function like this with the function keyword, you can also write a so-called arrow function. And attached you find a link with more details on these arrow functions. Again, it's not a React specific thing. To use that arrow function syntax, you replace function with const to create a new constant with a given name, app in this case. And then the value which you assign to this constant is an arrow function written like this. A list of parameters, then an equal sign and a greater sign, forming such an arrow, and then the function body between curly braces. And again, that's really just standard JavaScript code. You can absolutely stick to the function keyword. This is just a syntax which I personally prefer because it's a bit shorter, or yeah, I just prefer it. And therefore I will migrate all my functions to this syntax, like this here in the case of card, but you don't have to do that if you prefer the other syntax. It's really 100% optional, and in this case here, it doesn't offer any benefits or anything like that. It's really just personal preference, and I want to show this syntax here, since you also see that in a lot of React projects, and you therefore should be aware of it, that you can write your functions like this. Any functions, by the way, not just component functions. And with that, we're really done for this module. It was a huge module, and yet we're still only scratching the surface.
There's way more we can explore about React, and in the next section you'll get a practice project which will allow you to practice what you learned in this section, but thereafter we'll dive way deeper into React and we're going to explore more crucial React features. Most importantly there, after this exercise section, we'll explore the important concept of managing state in React apps and of building truly interactive user interfaces.